everyone. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Keeping It Behavioral, where we're empowering parents one episode at a time and breaking down behavioral analytic topics to what they look like in the real world. My name is Ray Trank, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Adrian Beggs. So today we're going to be looking at something really important for parents of children with autism, which is spotting red flags when choosing an ABA provider. So we're going to dive into the key signs to watch out for, like transparency issues or questionable qualifications. We've got your back in finding practical tips on finding a trusted ABA provider for your child. And so just things to keep in mind. So last episode, we did talk about questions, finding your fit, which is like, I think they tie in together, right? Mm-hmm. So that's something good to like keep in mind, those questions that we talked about last time. And then another thing that kind of is outside of these red flags, right, is the internet, in this case, right? Not all cases, but in this case, is your friend, right? You can search on, there are a million different like search engines, LinkedIn, all the things, to kind of look up the organization to see, how long they've been around, what their organization stands for, which I think will help a lot. But so once you kind of have done those things, this is kind of like the next step that we're just going to kind of dive into on what some red flags are.
And I think, I know too, you can use like Glassdoor, I think has some information on like companies in general, right? Glassdoor is one of the ones. I would say, like, of course, check out the individual company's website for general information. But of course, like, keep in mind as you are consuming that information that they're always going to be putting themselves in the best light possible.
Yeah.
So looking up some reviews.
It is kind of that balancing act, right? Because the danger you get into too with like Glassdoor is a lot of times it's like former employees who may, have some like history behind that. So I would be a little cautious if you're looking at like job forums, just because you do need to keep in mind that typically people who are doing those are because they left for a reason. But you can also look up what they're putting, because if they're citing something that is like really concerning, you can probably look it up to find out, like, is this a real thing? Or it can give you things to kind of keep an eye out when you're touring to see, like, okay, is this something that like seems like there's some merit behind it?
Well, yeah, and I would say I do think that people do put out some good reviews too on there, but I do think you're bringing up a good point. Just everything that you're consuming, take it with a grain of salt. Get the most holistic perspective possible when you're consuming different forms of information from different platforms, and then make your best decision possible. And of course, tour facilities, go speak to people, utilize any resources that they can give you, and a lot of
trust your gut.
Trust your gut, yeah. And a lot of places too, they'll tell you, if there's like videos that you can watch on former, families that happen to be getting services from there, you can kind of get a feel for a place, and just like Adrian said, trust your gut as much as possible. So as you are going through that process, just like Adrian said, doing some of that legwork so you kind of have a foundation to go off of when you are going into these situations, before you start asking some of those heavy hitting questions to get a better idea of what is the best fit for you and your family and your child. So we did want to just kind of break down some general quote unquote red flags to look out for, especially as you are, asking those important questions during your tours, doing your research, doing a lot of that legwork up front. It's important that once you get those answers, you're kind of able to look through them and see, okay, here are some things that might be red flags and might make us want to go another direction or pursue another company or provider. One of the first things that we wanted to cover was the importance of transparency within companies. Obviously, working with your children and serving the most important person in your life, it's a big job. It's an important job. And having that transparency and open communication between your provider, the company, and yourself as a parent is huge. And if a provider is ever hesitant or maybe seeming unwilling to give you some sort of clear information about how they approach the programming or what goals look like, or even their credentialing process for their clinicians, this could be a pretty serious red flag, and I think could be a reason you maybe take a step back.
100%. And I do think too, again, right, keeping everything in mind through a filter, right? HIPAA is a thing. So like, do keep that in mind with some of the questions you're asking. But a good provider too will kind of tell you, right? Like if you're asking something that is a little bit, going into something they're not able to disclose, like if it pertains to like a certain individual that you saw or asking about other people, right? They may not be able to answer that, but they'll let you know why. And I think that's kind of the biggest thing that goes along with that. The next one that we have is inadequate qualifications. So you want to make sure that, all the therapists and any supervisors have the appropriate qualifications, because if they're not, that's going to impact the quality of the services that you're receiving.
And by the appropriate qualifications, and what we're speaking of with that is, obviously, you would like your programming to be done by a BCBA, a board certified behavior analyst, if you are going into ABA services. And then technicians usually begin as behavior technicians, and then they go through different competency checks, which then after that they sit for a test, which then would lead to them being registered behavioral therapists. So I think it's a good sign when you're looking at those qualifications pieces, seeing maybe how the company is supporting technicians into being prepared for the testing so they can be registered. And then making sure that your child is being overseen by a board certified behavior analyst, someone that has gone through their master's program, has gone through the hours, taken the test. It just ensures a certain standard of care that you want to make sure that is being maintained.
Yeah, and I think, right, so there are BCABAs, which are board certified assistant behavior analysts, and some companies do utilize those too. And so I really think, asking the company if they do utilize that, and if they do, really finding out how they support those individuals who may not have as much of kind of like the educational background to ensure that those, not that those individuals aren't qualified, right, but there are less qualifications for that kind of position, and just making sure that if they are being supported so that way it doesn't impact quality.
Right, of course. And then our next thing, kind of going into qualification, transparency, all of that, is caseload sizes. This is something that I think we touched on in a previous episode when we were talking about those questions that you might want to ask. So this is there's not necessarily a perfect answer always, but
I think a lot of it depends, right? Because every person who's getting services, is getting different amounts of time, so there's no black and white answer.
And so like with the caseload sizes, we did put on here like large caseloads. Typically, you want to just be aware that might mean that your child's BCBA is splitting their time a lot more. However, as we touched on in our last episode, was some of those kids might be part-time. So the way that caseload sizes are determined has to do with the amount of hours that the families are given with insurance approval. So it's just something to keep in mind. I would say as a general standard of practice, having lower case load sizes is usually conducive to, I think, just better quality care, because you're going to get a lot more of that face-to-face hands-on time with your BCBA. So you can have that flex with programming and just more easy access to your child's BCBA. And then kind of going into that in the same vein, looking at some of the supervision requirements. So every BCBA is required to provide supervision, not only to your child, but also to the technician or RBT that is providing those direct services. So getting some clarification on how much of that is standard for the company, and also how closely that's aligning with just quality standards, is going to be really important.
Absolutely. And then the next one that we have is a high staff turnover. So, and I will say the field of ABA does have like a pretty high turnover rate, compared to other fields. However, if there's no consistency at all, that's going to impact your child, and I think you can get a sense too of, there should at least be like a large portion of the, staff members who are there more long term, right? Because there will be some turnover, but you can kind of get a feel for it if it's like, oh, literally no one has been here more than 6 months, like that's a little bit more concerning. Whereas if there's like, half the BCBAs and, half the techs have been there for multiple years, and then there's just a portion that have turned over, which I feel like is more.
Well, I think that it speaks to the amount of support sometimes, not always. Of course, there's a variety of reasons that people leave jobs. And like you said, our field is a challenging field, and very rewarding, but I think that does lead to that turnover piece. But it can also be a green flag if you have some of those, technicians who are staying there for longer periods of time because they're receiving adequate support so that they feel like they can do the best job possible. And it just tells you a lot about different ways that companies are pouring into their teams, to ensure great environments for learning for both the technicians and for the children. So it's just a good thing just to keep in the back of your mind. The next kind of point we wanted to talk about with red flags is, this kind of goes back to company values, and programming values, having an overemphasis on compliance and control. This has been I think a very big shift that the field of ABA has made, especially since the emergence of the compassionate care movement and really understanding and listening to voices of autistic individuals. It's really drastically improved and shaped the quality of therapy that we're able to do. So we bring this up because ABA therapy should really be centered and focused around empowering individuals with autism, teaching different skills so that they can learn and thrive, rather than just really diving in and pushing compliance and control and overutilizing things like punishment, which we can get into a whole episode on punishment because it's
very multifaceted.
Yes. And it may seem effective in the beginning because you get that immediate decrease in behaviors, but long term, we're not teaching actual skills so that these individuals know how to handle things that might be causing those behaviors to occur in the first place. So keeping in mind that punishment piece. And also, if you're working with a provider that is really emphasizing the strict control and almost obedience, over understanding and collaboration, that doesn't really align with where we are with best practices and ABA as a whole.
And I feel like too, when there's a lot of emphasis on that, compliance piece, it really loses like the individuality of the clients, right? Because we're not taking into consideration like what their interests are, what their natural personality is like. There are so many people who do have like very like strong-willed personalities, and we never want to like take away what makes them unique. We want to build the skills to where they can, communicate and have relationships and do all the things that people do, excuse me. But so, I feel like that just goes hand in hand, when the compliance piece comes in, it really like dehumanizes the individuals we're serving.
And autonomy is number one in everything that we do. And I know Adrian and I share this a lot as a programming value that I think is one of the things that kind of grounded us together was a similar approach to programming and really focusing on autonomy, compassion, self-advocacy, basically all things that we need to feel the most confident version of ourselves. And that's something that I think we both really value when we're setting our programming standards for our kiddos.
Absolutely. Another red flag to look out for is just a lack of individualization in the treatment plans. So when you're going through the intake process, it's, a process for sure, right? But so the provider is going to be finding out, your child's history, what your family is hoping to get out of therapy, all these things. And then they're going to give you that treatment plan, which will be submitted to insurance. And in that, you really want to look at it deeply to make sure they're actually reflecting the values that you shared with them and what they're creating. Right. Because it's never too late, right? Even if they do the assessment, they do the treatment plan, that's not like a binding contract that you have to start services with them. And so I think really taking a look at it and, go to them and say like, hey, these are things that I expressed to you when we were meeting, and I don't feel like it's reflected. Because, right, we're all human. We all make mistakes sometimes, and see like, okay, do they take that feedback and really apply it? Or are they just giving me like a cookie cutter, plan for my child that really doesn't take into account any of their individuality or any of their interests, right, any of our family's values?
For sure. And I think that's one of the first things. I know when I'm having my very first meeting with families, that's one of the first things I like to explain is, the value base. How do I individualize my treatment plans? How do I come up with different treatment plan ideas? And like you said, that piece of speaking to the values of the family is going to be so important in meeting those needs, which kind of brings us into our next red flag is limited parent involvement. The value base that you go into therapy with is the most important thing, and any practitioner that you're working with should be prioritizing what you are hoping to see from your child, and setting them up for success and setting you up for success. If you do not work with a practitioner or a company that really places a heavy emphasis on that parent involvement, we tend to see reduced outcomes. There's a lot of literature out on this, talking about how parent involvement drastically shapes outcomes and can actually lead to more consistent and rapid skill acquisition with learners. So being with the company that really prioritizes that and sees that as a key way to teach skills is going to be really important, because it's huge for skill development for all learners and being on the same page.
Well, ultimately, right, like they're your child. They're going to spend the majority of the time with you. You are the one constant in their life, that's there for them and supporting them. And so if the provider that you're using isn't, checking in with you on like how things are going, what's working, what's not working, right? Because maybe when you go in, you have this great idea of like, oh, like this is what we're going to use to communicate. And the provider's like, fantastic, we're going to do it. But then if it's not working, in real life, and the provider isn't getting any feedback on that, then, we're kind of losing that support. And it just, like you said, Ray, it impacts the quality and the acquisition of skills. Mm-hmm. And, it's really on the provider to be checking in to make sure, what's working is working. And if it's not, it's not. Additionally, just communication and collaboration. So whenever, a provider is providing services, they should be communicating with you and being really, upfront with anything that's going on. They should, if they're not, excuse my dog, sorry.
He's making a little caveat.
On the floor, like not even getting up, but he has to bark back. But so if the provider is like unresponsive, if they're dismissive of your concern, if they're not collaborating with other team members, it's going to impact your child's progress. And it's also going to really impact your trust, especially if your kiddo, right, needs a lot of support with communication. The provider is the one who's able to kind of fill you in on what's going on day to day. And you just need that trust.
Right. And I think you're hitting on a lot of really important things where the foundation of good communication too, like you said, is trust, and having a judgment-free environment where you can just express whatever concerns you have, ask all the questions, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We all want, you know, your child to thrive. We want them to be successful, and that's going to come with all of us coming together as a team and just having a lot of open communication. One of our last, I mean, there's obviously other red flags, but I guess another overarching branch, and one of our final ones we wanted to talk about today was, a big red flag is whenever you see providers who focus on curing autism. This is a hot button issue, because I think that when you first are getting that diagnosis from your child, you're trying to figure out anything that you can do to set them up for success. And unfortunately, there are companies out there, products out there that are going to claim that they have this magical cure for autism. If you just pay them X amount of dollars, this will be yours. Unfortunately, that is not how things work with autism. Autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental difference, and you know, ABA, as we're talking about, and this is something obviously we're very passionate about, can be really beneficial in improving different skills and behaviors, but the goal is never curing autism. It's just to help create and foster skill building so that we can really help individuals shine, as you know, they're cultivating their sense of identity. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Adrian.
No, I think you said that so well. And I think it really does go back to, right, like the embracing your child as an individual, right? And any provider should want to, you know, like you said, right, help cultivate skills, help, you know, build them up. It's not about curing them or changing them or anything like that. We want to make sure, you know, they're getting the support they need so they can communicate, right? And they can involve themselves in like daily tasks and do all those sorts of things, but it's never to take away from their individuality or who they are or the things that they like, the things they enjoy. We want to build on that. And any provider who tells you different, you know, is not coming from the right place.
Right. Totally agree. So these are just some of our little overarching things to just keep an ear out for whenever you're asking all those amazing, important questions that you can reference on our previous episode. What we just talked about is a good roadmap just to, you know, keep an eye out for some of those red flags so that you can make sure that you're finding the best fit for your family and finding the best outcomes for your child.
Absolutely. So we are keeping it behavioral, guiding autism and fostering hope. We're here for you every other Thursday-ish. You know, we are human and we are also very busy. And, you know, life happens sometimes, but that's the goal. But so follow us on Instagram at Keeping It Behavioral. And again, you know, just like we say at the end of every episode, right, we're behavior analysts. We're here to, you know, share our knowledge base, share our personal experiences, but we're not giving any individualized advice or treatment guidance. We're just kind of, you know, sharing our perspectives and working to create a community to discuss these topics, and which I think, you know, not to go on another soapbox, but I do feel like it's really important, especially these more like taboo areas, to really have, you know, share our perspective. So see y'all.
Totally agree. Bye.